Hey everybody, this is Ian,
Hey, it's Paul.
and we're back for twice in 1 month doing the surviving. What are we called?
I was gonna
Surviving
say
Central
it's
City
been so long we
podcast.
forgot what it was even called. Yeah,
I don't even know what's happening. I'm over. I have way too much caffeine, and my brain is working not as well because of it.
yeah, yeah.
So, this episode is going to be about incident complexity. I'll leave it at that. I'll throw it to Paul, and I'll come back to. I can't just say one thing. Like my brain is just like, bleh, I have a
Yeah,
million
yeah,
things I
yeah.
want to say.
Right.
So, go ahead, Paul, with your spiel.
Yeah. So, welcome back, everybody. Just a quick reminder: we have a couple of ways you can get a hold of us or follow us on social media. We actually do have a Facebook page, Surviving Central City. Believe it or not, for those that still hang on there, we have X. I think I mentioned Twitter the last time. I forgot.
No,
Now it's called
don't call it X. Don't call it X.
Uh,
Not cool.
I could make so many X references there. DMX, Generation X, like, let's just, throw show our age a little bit. Yeah, so on Twitter, we can follow us at SurvivingCC, and then you can always email us at SurvivingCC or SurvivingCentralCity@gmail.com. So there we go. Both of us, I think, are struggling this morning with the
Yeah,
coffee.
it's Saturday morning. You were just talking about Twitter, and I was just thinking, we could actually buy our legitimacy on Twitter now. The Elon Musk thing, like
Yeah,
$20 get a blue check, and all of a
yeah,
sudden
heck
we're
yeah,
official.
yeah. We're official. Yeah, maybe people will follow us more. I don't know.
No, I'm broke. So we have to invent our own legitimacy in the future
Right.
because I don't have the extra funds just to throw at Elon Musk. I think he's doing fine.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, anyways, so we're going to talk about incident complexity today. But I guess, you know what? Let me rewind because we went like a year and a half with no podcast at all.
Yeah.
We probably have no one listening anymore. We started to build up, a little bit of momentum. We vanished for a
Right.
year and a half, and everybody unsubscribed and added Joe Rogan or whatever the hell they do. So, what's been going on with you, Paul? Because we didn't really give an update last time.
No, we didn't. We didn't. And maybe that's we could say probably lie and say that this is a contributing factor as to why it took us so long to get back into the podcast arena. But
It's your fault, is what you're saying.
it's my
It's okay.
fault. Yeah, we'll blame me. Yeah, but I did. About a year ago, a little more than a year ago now, make a pretty significant career change, and we did talk about this a little bit in a previous episode. I can't remember which one it was. May have been the last one we did actually, which was about a little bit about burnout and work-life balance in the field, and we kind of addressed this too in our last episode with Ben, talking about how it's 24/7 profession, and I've been in it for a long time, and so made a difficult choice to make a change career-wise and jump into the private sector, and leave I think it was about 17 years in the public local government sector in public safety before making the jump. So for those that I'm sure know it because it's around for a lot of folks that listen to the podcast. I'm in the public alerting private sector arena now with Everbridge. Still get to work with a lot of the folks in my previous job in Fairfax and in the National Capital Region, supporting what they do with that platform, and still have a passion for obviously emergency management, but also my niche has always kind of been in that same as you, technology, how it applies to emergency management and public alert and warning, and so that's what I'm doing now. That's what I've been doing now for about a year. So big shift for me, obviously, and for those that maybe have ever considered it, or I know there's some that we know that have made a similar jump. It's a bit jarring, right? Going from a local government sector position to the private sector. That those two worlds are a very different kind of animal, and the day to day is a bit different, and the expectations can be a bit different. So it's been an interesting, challenging, good for me, at least personally, year in that change, and still hanging around, clinging on to some of those in the emergency management profession at the local level, just to kind of keep my toes in the water there. But that's what I've been up to. So pretty significant on that front. What about you? What have you been doing for the last year and a half?
I have literally nothing showing. I've got nothing going on. So yeah, I play a lot of video games.
Yeah. This I know. Yeah.
Yeah. The new one is Helldivers. If anybody's listening and you play any type of games and you haven't played Helldivers, you're I don't know what you're doing, honestly.
Yeah, it's fun.
So you should check that out. They don't have it on Xbox. It's just PlayStation. Is that
PlayStation
right?
and PC, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been doing that in my free time, which this week was about an hour.
Yeah. What'd you do this week?
This week taught a planning section chief class. Me and two other people taught a planning section chief class for a local law enforcement agency. So that was cool. It's for those of people listening who are familiar with FEMA curriculums, they are sometimes challenging to communicate, especially because you have vastly different experience in the audience.
Right.
It was pretty good overall. I think that we made it make sense for the most part, even with some of the challenges administratively that existed that were outside of our control. Week before that, I was off, planning on doing a bunch of springtime work. I got these fruit trees and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
and it rained the entire week. So
that's right, it did.
That was a useless exercise. At least I wasn't, attached to my Outlook for 7 days, so that was cool.
Right.
Other than that, I've got trying to plan an IMT exercise in June, which we have about 70 people signed up for.
Awesome.
So Monday and Tuesday, I have to write that exercise for the midterm planning meeting on, I think, Wednesday.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. And then there's a state strategic planning meeting. There's a bunch of stuff happening. So I have 5 years left. I'm just gonna keep repeating that. I have 5 years left before I can just vanish, because it's I look back and I've got 23 and a half years with my jurisdiction, and it went by fast, and then it feels like the past 3 months have been 23 and a half years.
Right, it's crawling, right.
And now that I can kind of see retirement, there's a light at the end of the tunnle, it's just dragging and dragging and dragging. Every day I wake up going, how long is it now? How long is it now? So it's interesting. So I know it'll go by quick when I get there, but I'm just...
You'll look back and it'll be like, man, where did all this time go? But getting there is a little tough,
Yeah, like you said, the burnout. So...
Right.
Yeah, I've always been burnt out, but it's far worse now. So, anyways, that's about it. So we'll jump into incident complexity. So, I guess one of the things I wanted to throw out up front is, you can, number one, this is a pretty large component of the incident command system, which we've dabbled in over the past 7 episodes. But we've talked at length about the easiest way to chip it off into bite-sized pieces. Because there's literally classes and classes and classes and classes. What is it? 15 position-specific classes, something like that. And then there's the 305 classes and 300 and 400. And there's a never
ending.
Yeah, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of hours worth of classroom to cover all this stuff.
Yeah.
So we are starting to chip away at the very basics and trying to put foundational stuff in place so that we can continue talking about it without people glazing over. Because unless you do it every day and unless you've seen it work, it's lame.
Right.
And it's one of the examples I always tell people. When I first kind of walked face first into the brick wall of incident command, it was, I think, 2006. I went through ICS 300 and 400, which was in the initial round of deliveries. And ICS 300 and 400, for those you don't know, it's supposed to be incident command system basics for supervisors-ish, giving it a generic title. And I walked out of that going, this is ridiculous. Never doing this. It's the biggest bureaucracy nonsense I've ever seen in my life.
Right.
And I think, at least at that time, the vast majority of the people came out of that course with the same thing.
Yeah.
So most people walked away saying, this is lame. And since they've been to that course, unless they've gotten to see it work, they're still saying that.
Yeah.
But when you actually see it work and you understand all the different moving parts, it's pretty incredible when it's working. And I'll just shut up. So I'm going to go back to talking about incident complexity. So incident complexity, the general idea behind this concept is that when something bad happens in any jurisdiction, we'll use Central City. And for those of you who skipped ahead, Central City is kind of the common location that we destroy during every scenario.
In all these classes.
Every class. Yeah.
Right. So, hence the name of the podcast.
Right. Yeah.
I think most of them got it. I think most people picked it up on it.
Yeah. So I don't want to pick on a particular jurisdiction by naming them as where we're going to destroy.
Right.
So let's just say Central City. We have a bad thing happens. incident complexity is literally a way of classifying how bad the bad thing is.
Right.
That's about all of it. What fascinated me was, when I went through incident commander training and started working on my task book, like trying to get qualified as an IC, incident commander, incident complexity is a big deal. There's certain things you have to do constantly, like an incident complexity analysis, which we'll talk about shortly.
Yeah.
But what fascinated me was I was doing planning section chief last week. It comes up there, incident complexity, and so it's not as it's not something that everybody throughout an ICS organization is even. It's not even going to be on their radar.
Right. I was just going to say, yeah. For me, like it's something for the most of my tenure wasn't something I ever thought about. Not something I was involved in. Like you hear things get typed, right? And like you hear, and we throw it out all the time. Like we're part of a Type 3 IMT, or oh yeah, this is a Type 3 type incident, or there's a particular resource that's a type. I'm a Type 3 qualified planning section chief or whatever. What does that actually mean? It sounds cool. What does that mean?
Right, and even at the federal, well, I'll come back to that. The federal level is kind of moving away from some of the Type 1 and 2 as well, but we can talk about a little, at least as far as incident management teams go. But it's so something bad happens in Central City. Yeah. So let's say there's a car accident. 3 people injured. You need a few ambulances, a couple cops, fire truck, because the firemen have to block traffic. So you have this accident, and if you look at that in a vacuum, it has very little impact probably on the overall public safety response for Central City.
Right.
Right. So in very basic, no context of that incident, that would be like a Type 5 incident, which is the lowest complexity type for an incident. Now, as you start moving up through the ladders, it gets pretty interesting pretty quickly. So a Type 4, and this is where it dabbles into ICS. So this is, the lowest number is the smallest, the biggest number is the largest incident. So a Type 4 would be an incident that does have impact on that local community. So it could be, let's say, a small hazmat.
Right.
You have a. I'm trying to think of what a small hazmat looks like. You could have, a very small gas truck tip over, or something.
I was gonna say, yeah, or like a tractor trailer just happens to be driving through your jurisdiction with something bad in the back, and it falls out.
Right.
Or which actually I had that happen in a jurisdiction I was in. So, and it wasn't like a big deal. It was a pretty small area that was impacted, but we shut down a major roadway, and it was about a 24-hour event.
So what fell out? Cesium, plutonium, uranium?
No, I want to say it was like like acid batteries or something like that. It wasn't like anything like real bad. Like it wasn't radioactive or any kind. But it was significant in that it took a whole bunch of special. The hazmat team had to come out and evaluate what actually is it that fell out of the truck. It was labeled as something that could potentially be hazmat, and so they had to do all this analysis on like what's the truck carrying, what fell out of the truck, because it carried multiple things, so it wasn't just like it was the only product it was carrying. And then they had to figure out like, did it contaminate the soil? Did it contaminate the waterway because it was next to like a creek? It was like a whole thing. So that process, to pick it up and dispose of it was probably like 20 minutes, but the whole process of trying to figure out what actually happened and how bad the impact was to the environment was like a 24-hour ordeal. Yeah, it was. And because it was on a major thoroughway and we closed it for 24 hours, that was a major impact to just traffic in the area.
Yeah, absolutely. That wasn't as cool. I was really hoping for the radiation.
Yeah, no, I didn't have a real cool story there.
Killer zombie virus or something like that. But that'll work. That'll do for the example.
Right.
So we have this the Type 4 incident, what we just described. So it's an incident that's large enough that it's going to go on for a little while. It takes enough resources to strain the response capability of the local jurisdiction. In IMT talk, or incident management talk, that may require a few incident management personnel who are trained to come in and help foster the planning process for a Type 4 incident. Right. However, it's not a requirement. There's a lot of jurisdictions specifically that have a lot of resources that literally just throw resources at the bad thing. Right. They'll just overwhelm the bad thing with as much stuff as they can possibly muster until it goes away.
Right.
That may sound inefficient because it is, but that's kind of what happens in most places, I would say. And then you have type 3, and type 3 would be something that affects the region for the most part. Now, in our area, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, Paul.
Sure.
In our area, I think our region is more like well, let me rewind. So we have basically type 3 is regional, type 2 generally is statewide. So it's kind of straining the resources of the state, and then type 1 is national. However, we're in Northern Virginia. Not currently, but I work in Northern Virginia, and I can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
So
who can?
AOL stockholders. I mean, I don't. That's Google executives.
Right.
And of course, firemen. So anyways, we have the we go from regional, state to national, type 3, type 2, type 1. Now, what's interesting about our region, and the amount of people there and the amount of resources there, is any incident that hurts our region and strains the resources in our region is a type 2. Because it's almost like its own state.
Right.
So and again, I'm giving no context, very like 30,000 foot level definitions of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I always thought that was interesting when you're talking about regional, because generally they're talking about regions of a state.
Right. And if you're in like if you're maybe in other parts of Virginia, not in Northern Virginia, but in where we reside, in like just south of Northern Virginia, which is I think a state region of Region 2, by like a state classification, which incorporates a number of different counties within Virginia. That's I think a classic example of a regional incident, right? Something that impacts multiple counties in the same region. Nova or Northern Virginia, unique because of its kind of tri-state, DMV area where you're bordering on parts of Maryland, and DC is in the mix too, and so you get this kind of weird tri-state, not even tri-state, right? Because of DC being its own thing, but this kind of weird, multi-state response, and you also have a bajillion and a half resources in that same small kind of particular tri-state region. So technically, by definition, probably type 2, but because of the amount of resources and the amount of kind of just mutual aid already existing in that area, and a lot of stuff already kind of flows back and forth naturally between those states, we don't typically respond in that way as a type 2. It's not usually at that level of a type 2 when when something does occur. Right. Which is, it's interesting. So I guess it kind of plays into that complexity analysis, and not just taking some of these definitions at face value of what they say in the book. Like, this is what it says. It is,
Yeah, so there is no, like I said, it's 30,000 foot. There really is no black and white, and we'll talk about how to determine some of this stuff here shortly. But for anybody who's listening that's like, I want to be a incident commander on a Type 3, 2 and 1 don't really exist anymore, but IMTs, I want to be an IC on one. This is going to matter to you specifically. Everybody else, it's just kind of, awareness level information. Yeah. But, to our point, so you have 3 is regional, meaning it's straining the region. 2 is statewide. 1 is national. So 3, I'm trying to think of a good example of a 3. Let's say it's a bigger hazmat than what Paul just indicated. And in our area, let's say that hazmat happened at the mixing bowl, or, where all of the interstates kind of come together. Right. If an incident happens, let's say that hazmat happens on one of those roads where everything connects, and they have to evacuate for a half mile or a mile, those roads get shut down. And, you could make the case that's then depending on how long it's going to be, that's a national emergency based on where we live. Yeah. However, in general, that would be, the same incident, but where it's located could change the complexity of that incident because of the cascading impacts, meaning the roads being shut down, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Then you have, a statewide incident. We didn't quite reach there, but we had a string of wildfires a few weeks ago in northwestern Virginia that were straining resources in the state. And the reason that happened is because we had such dry weather. So you had the places where the fires were, they were asking for resources from the state and from the people around them, and the people around them were also dealing with these fires in their own jurisdictions. They may not have been as big as the ones that were wildfires, but everybody had brush fires, outside fires, and everybody was nervous about going to help these other jurisdictions when they've got the beginnings of a similar situation at home. And then Type 1, the easy example to me is like Deepwater Horizon. Yeah. That's
a classic example, in textbooks.
In textbooks. Yeah, you've got Deepwater Horizon, Hurricane Katrina. Anytime you turn on the news and you're seeing 15 different uniforms in the background. Some fed different states, different localities. It's a pretty good indication. That it's a national incident that is straining the resources of the entire country in dealing with it.
Right.
So, why does this matter? I mean, do you have an idea, Paul? Like, why does this matter to anybody?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, why classify these things as anything? Why label them as a type of any kind? And generally, I think we kind of alluded to it, right? I think most of the time, you're trying to determine what it's going to take to resolve said incident. And when I say what it's going to take, how many and what kind of resources is it going to take to mitigate this event? And to get an idea of its complexity or the scale of the event gives you a good indication of where you're going to be when it comes to how many resources it'll take, what kind of resources it's going to take to mitigate the event. So I think that's why, right? That's right. One of the biggest reasons why.
So, one of the examples actually, I didn't even have that much to do with it until later on, but some of our people from our incident management team created a tabletop for some of the incident commanders in our region. Mm-hmm. And a tabletop, for those who don't know, is just an exercise where you sit down and talk through a problem. And so this tabletop, the scenario was that somebody is working as a supervisor in a certain area of the county, and a tornado comes through. So tornado touches down, takes out some houses in a neighborhood. Okay, yeah. So you, as a street supervisor, are now responsible for going and dealing with a tree into a house or 3 trees into 3 houses. Okay, right. So is that a big deal? Sure. Is that by itself type 3, type 2, whatever incident? Right. No. Okay, because you can look at that and say, well, we deal with this all the time. Every time there's a thunderstorm, we have these incidents. What those people don't see is the other 75 of them in the same jurisdiction,
right.
So they're in charge. They have tunnel vision. They have their silo. They're in their silo and they're working on making sure they mitigate the hazards, save the puppies. Whatever it is that they need to do.
Right. Get their picture taken.
Right. Yeah. Get the picture taken. Give the news interview. Whatever the case may be.
Right.
Meanwhile, somebody, in our case, like somebody at headquarters, somebody somewhere up the chain is looking at the big picture and going, okay, we have all of these going on at once. So while that one incident may not make it, a type 3, type 2 incident, maybe a type 4, we can handle that locally. That tornado that touched down wiped out a bunch of neighborhoods in this scenario, took the roof off one of the hospitals so that's getting evacuated. So now all of a sudden you've got a type 3, type 2 incident. And it's imperative that somebody in that chain of command is able to identify that, because being able to pull the appropriate incident management resources to help manage that incident is going to make it a whole lot more efficient for them and make better use of their resources in the long run, and as well as keeping them out of the Washington Post.
Yes,
which is always the, that's what I always tell people, the Washington Post test.
Right.
Like, okay, so if we do it this way, are you comfortable with the Washington Post describing it that way?
Right.
Or is there a better way to do it?
Yeah.
Is always, my question or my challenge. So
right.
Our goal is to make sure that those initial folks and their supervisors realize, like, hey, we need to be thinking about not just like putting out spot fires, but thinking about, what the big picture is and how can we best manage all of them at once, because ultimately we can't do it the same way we do it every day.
Right. Now, would you say in your experience that that's usually in the real world when something like this does occur, is there somebody typically up high enough in the chain identifying that quickly or realizing this quickly enough to then make the smart decision of saying, hey, we need to escalate this, we need to involve an incident management team, we need to start a process for requesting incident management resources, or does it usually take, maybe like they've been overwhelmed, or somebody comes in and says, like, what the heck's going on here? Like, you should have done this 2 days ago. Like, what are we doing?
This is a great question, and this could be another 6 podcast episodes just on the answer to this question. To be brief, I think that there is the people who went through the initial ICS training back in 2006 with me, they never got to see it work.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are around retirement age where they're eligible for retirement. So I've spent the last 12 years trying to convince them, for the most part, and say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And then, no, I'm not doing that, whatever, and I just go back to my corner. I'm like, okay, cool. So over the past 3 or 4 years, I think we've had a lot of people promoted, a lot of turnover, and I think we're in a better situation now because a lot of those folks have gotten to see it work. In addition, we're kind of targeting, again, I work for a local fire department, so this carries across to all public safety, but I'm at the point where I'm now targeting lieutenants and captains. Like, they're the ones I want to train. because in 4, 5, 6 years,
Right,
they're going to be
coming
the
up.
Chiefs. And that, I mean, to me, that's how we change the culture and get
Right.
people to think more about the big picture. So, in general, I'd say
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the only way. That's the only thing I have left. I mean, so by the time I retire, hopefully
Right.
we would have made some inroads, and we do have some people in good spots now that get it, and are kind of drinking. They ask questions. They want to know how to do it, and I don't have all the answers. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? But just the fact that they have identified, hey, there may be a better way to do this. You know,
Right.
let's figure this out. I think that is that gives me optimism, and I think every jurisdiction is like this. To your question, I mean, when you go, and I hate talking about wildfires because this entire system was created in wildfires.
Right.
We've been doing it 50 years. You know.
Right.
So that being said, out there, you know, you have California. I'll say California, and I don't know all the details of how everything works in California, but they have a brush fire.
Yeah.
And they go out, they send a small crew to go out and put out the fire. That crew will immediately do an analysis on it and send it up the chain of command.
Mm-hmm.
The chain of command can then look at all the incidents around them. So maybe
Right.
it was a lightning strike, maybe it's dry weather, you know, whatever the case may be. They'll look at the incidents around them and go, oh, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll bring in very early an incident management team really to coordinate all of these different incidents and make
Yeah.
them one incident so that they're not fighting over, I need an engine. No, I need an engine.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's kind of the gist of it. So
Yeah, in those places, I think where they're facing significant wildfires, you see this concept really. I mean, this is where a lot would argue the concept really was born from, anyway. But you see a lot of this use much more common early. You know, the identification, the acceptance of incident management concepts is a lot more prolific in the wildfire community than many others. Like, because we just had, so we, not necessarily directly in our area, but not far away from us, there was the Francis Key Scott Bridge. Francis Key Scott.
That's it.
Yeah.
That didn't sound right. What is it?
No, thank you. The Key Bridge, gets hit, falls into the river, right outside of Baltimore, and there's an initial event, right? Like there's the bridge falls. There's a life safety concern. They're trying to recover, rescue, then recover some folks that were on the bridge, and then there's the long-term effects of the debris and the shipping channel block, the reroute of significant traffic, because many may not know, in that area, there's 2 tunnels that also go through that same area for travel, and you can't take certain trucks and certain hazmats can't go through the tunnel. So now they had to use that bridge, which is no longer there. Now they got to go a different way, which cascades down to many other factors, systems, states that are involved in that potential issue. So in that situation, from a complexity standpoint, what could have occurred, what should maybe have been brought in early, what is being done from an incident management concept, that's something, and I don't know, I haven't looked actually to see. I know there is a Maryland IMT. I know there are incident management team concepts in that area. I just don't know how they were applied, or if they were applied in that particular incident at all. Something to maybe look into, but a good, maybe a different look at a pretty significant incident here in our area that would have similar concepts that's not wildfire related.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And I'm surprised we didn't even mention that bridge last week, or 2 weeks ago. But I was getting texts and phone calls when people first saw that happen on the news. And I know everybody's seen the video now, but at the time, I was like searching social media, which is what I always do, and I saw that video of the lights going out. Everybody's seen it by now. And I was like, ooh, that's not great,
Right.
And it leaves a lot of, especially at that time, 4:30 in the morning, whatever it was,
Right.
watching this video. I get all my speculation in at once about what's going on. But I was getting a bunch of texts and phone calls and whatever, and it was kind of like looking at this like, no, Coast Guard. Nah, Coast Guard, And so that's what ended up happening. And for those of you, we haven't talked about it before, Coast Guard has an enormous incident management capability. So, wildfire... I would say wildfire created it, and Coast Guard is running with it full speed.
Right.
And they have been for a long, long time. So even back to Deepwater Horizon, I mean, they had huge, massive incident management resources on scene,
Right.
helping to make that make sense, because it affected. Think about 3 states at least. Multiple jurisdictions within those states, federal assets, state assets, local assets, private corporation. Coast Guard is also very good at incident management. And so, when that first happened, looking at what was going on and saying, that's definitely going to be Coast Guard. That's definitely going to be. And luckily, I was right. I was dodging. if I would have been dodging that event like the Matrix. You know what I mean? For a variety of reasons that I won't go into right now. But so then that is obviously a Type 1 national incident, because of the political impact, etc. And we'll get to the checklist in a second.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, or what I would say then, is you have the initial incident commanders, like we were talking about, who should be sending their complexity analysis or identifying how big and bad this thing is up their chain, who can then match resources to the incident typing, Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, for incident management resources to go help with those incidents. Does all that make sense to you, Paul, before I keep talking?
It does, but again, I've been in that world too, so yes, but it does to me, so I think we're as good as we're going to be on that particular topic. I will say just one thing to clarify. So we mentioned there were 5 types traditionally. Now you mentioned that they're kind of changing that at the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 level, but there is kind of that for wildfire. There's that split where you have Type 5 and Type 4 are kind of really local, and then you get into Type 3, Type 2, and Type 1. That's where you're kind of branching out to a larger, not just local, but regional or statewide and then national. So there's that break is at that between that Type 4 and Type 3, and we typically see a lot of times, or you'll hear it, I think, or at least I've heard it kind of explained as Type 5 is your everyday incident, which we say everyday kind of offhanded, but the typical public safety response with police and fire to 911 calls. That's typically Type 5 stuff. Type 4 is where you kind of need some more of your partners in the local level. We've mentioned this at the last episode, where you have maybe public works or public health or some other partners from within your jurisdiction that are helping to, as a resource, helping to mitigate this particular event. So it's a little bigger than your kind of traditional everyday incident, but still locally handled. And then you kind of jump to the Type 3, where now you kind of maybe bringing in a more qualified resource in a Type 3 IMT that's made up of folks specially trained, ideally, in incident management.
Absolutely. And so one thing, we have, like I said, 30,000 foot. Boom. Here's what this means. How big it is, how bad it is. But incident commanders, and you can Google this if you are so inclined, dear listeners, but there is a tool called Incident Complexity Analysis that you can Google, and various agencies have created their checklists, basically, where it'll ask you a question. Is this happening? Yes or no? Is this happening? Yes or no? And so you go through 15, 20 questions, yes, no, yes, no. You get to the bottom, and it says if you have 7 yeses, you need this type of incident management team. If you have 12 yeses, you need this type of incident management team. So what factors, make something, we genericized it, and said national, state, whatever. But what factors exist that would make something national, regional, whatever? So I have write up FEMA. The writers that work at FEMA do a very good job, whether they're contracted or FEMA employees, and they also get paid by the word. So while a lot of the
love you, FEMA.
A lot of the incident complexity analysis you'll see are like one page, or it's like one page, and on the back it has like how to fill out, or very brief instructions. FEMA's is I have it pulled up right now. It is 25 pages. Yeah, so they do have a good chart on it, though. If you happen to look it up, the NIMS Incident Complexity Guide on page 14 has basically the general categories that are scored to make something a different Type 3, Type 2, Type 1, etc. Right. So those are resistance to stabilization, meaning how hard is it to deal with in general, how long it's going to last, effects on the human population around the incident, how long the effects of that hazard are going to be there, are evacuations necessary, critical infrastructure impacts, political issues, which is hard to quantify, but you know it when you see it. I'll say it that way. And maybe I'll come up with a example, something that may have happened at some point later on to talk about some political issues. And then...
be careful, you might get assassinated.
Yeah. Probably the people I'm talking about, if they were capable of that, we wouldn't have any of the political issues that we had. So, And then the probability of cascading impacts, or meaning multiple things happening down the line because of the original hazard, is generally, I think, how we describe cascading impacts. I'm sure somebody more eloquent than me could articulate it better. But just so you know, those are kind of the factors that are scored in that incident complexity analysis to lead you out to what the actual type of the incident is, or how big is it, how bad is it.
Right. And I would say too, like we mentioned, there's multiple versions, right? Or there's different organizations that have come up with their own version or checklist based on maybe their mission or their whatever they're dealing with, like the Coast Guard versus FEMA versus wildfire community, versus an all hazards approach kind of a community. No wrong answer, right? Like, I mean, any of them could be used. You kind of just need to determine which one makes most sense for your mission or your area, your jurisdiction, whatever you're dealing with, to make a decision. Like I think sometimes we always get into these ideas of, especially maybe in the FEMA world with all these FEMA classes and things, like this is the only way it can be done, and this is the way it has to be done, and this is the way it is done. And it's not the case, right? There's a lot of flexibility in a lot of this. Maybe not so much for our NIMS purists out there, but you can kind of adapt and take from each of them to make whatever you need when it comes to a lot of this, complexity analysis or any of this other stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah. So when I was doing my IC task book, we had I had a coach who was an incident commander from Coast Guard, very well respected, well known. Had supervised some very, very, very large incidents in the past, and so he got on me immediately, like, you haven't done your incident complexity analysis, and I'm like. I was involved in the design of the exercise. I know what the complexity is. Like, no, you don't understand. He's like, you have to go in and go through, score this, and then tell your team what it is. And what part of his thing was, we have a team of 30 to 50 people, whatever, that's working on this incident, and we need to also let them know what they're up against. So that they can kind of brace themselves. And it's kind of an intangible, but I think it does make a difference. When I had another conversation with a group of people when I was deployed with them, where I typed an incident and told them, like, we have 13 people and this is a type 1 incident and we're not getting help.
Yeah, it definitely changes.
So we're all clear.
Yeah, it changes your mentality, like your framing of like, okay.
Right. So it's really like, focus people, like, tune in, because the cavalry's not coming. You know what I mean? Like, this is what's going on and this is what we're dealing with, but the cavalry's not coming. So anyways, that's an example. Another thing that can be used for is sending to the locality or the state to support a disaster declaration.
Right.
So you send it up the chain. You say, this is a type 1 incident, because usually, especially for initial incident commanders, they're going to get on scene of something and go, this is bad, but I've got a lot of toys to help deal with it. And so they'll start requesting resources, whatever. But if they do this analysis, they send it up the chain, and you may have an emergency operations center, either at local or state, or a regional coordinator with the state, who's ideally getting multiple of these and going, oh, this isn't good.
Right.
And that can help support a state disaster declaration, so on and so forth. So there's a variety of uses that get used way more in wildfire, et cetera, Coast Guard. But there's just, again, 35, 40,000 foot level.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that before we move on, Paul?
No, I think that you summed it up actually very nicely there. I was gonna move us on to kind of another tool in the toolbox, I guess, when it comes to, we talked about typing of incidents and how that's done with a complexity analysis and why that's done. But we mentioned earlier that resources also have the ability to be typed, and it kind of helps you frame what kind of incidents, or based on the type of incident, what kind of resources you would need and what type of resource you would need to mitigate the incident, right? So it's kind of a relational component of resources and incident types. And there is a tool for that too, the resource type library tool, the RTLT, which is a FEMA tool that allows, or is built to do just this, right? It's a tool built to help you at a jurisdictional level figure out what you have and what type of resource it is, so that when you get into these situations of somebody saying to you at an IC level, like, hey, we are dealing with a type 3 incident, or we're dealing with a type 2 incident because of the complexity, you can kind of take a quick gander at your inventory of resources that have been typed ideally prior to this event and see, like, oh crap, I don't have what we need to mitigate this thing. I'm going to need more resources, or better resources to help handle this event, versus what I already have, kind of in my cavalry, if you will. And so the kind of application of analyzing what you have and kind of labeling it in a way that makes it easy to understand what it can help you with versus what it can't help you with is important too. And those two things need to kind of come together when you're dealing with a bad event.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I'd point out, because I was prior to 2015, I was under the impression that if you're on a Type 3 incident, then you need Type 3 resources. And that's not the case. So I'll just say it's not the case as a general rule. Right. So as an example, the typing tool basically defines like a Type 4 engine nationally for a fire engine is always this, and it has this capability. And so if Paul is in Alaska and sends out a request for a Type 4 engine, I can get that in Virginia and go, I know exactly what they need because we're speaking the same language. So it's a way to make sure that Paul gets the resources he needs without us sending the wrong tool. Right. So while there sometimes is a relationship between the incident complexity of 54321, it's not always applicable to the typing of actual resources. So as an example, the Type 4 engine, right? In our urban firefighting, Type 1 engines, I think for the most part, like where we live, meaning they hold a certain amount of water, like the definition. They hold a certain amount of water, they weigh a certain amount, so on and so forth. If you were on a Type 1 wildfire, you would never see a Type 1 engine. Right. Because they can't drive to the places where the wildfires are. You know what I mean? So you're far more likely to see a whole lot of Type 4 engines on a wildfire than you would ever see a Type 1 engine. So it's just a way of going, okay, Type 4 in the case, and this is me, again, 30,000 foot, genericizing this, but a Type 4 of any resource is the least capable, and a Type 1 is the most capable. Right. But you have to mix and match for different incident types.
It's based on your needs, right? Based on your
needs, exactly.
Yes.
So, and I know that can be confusing. It didn't hit me until I was working at an area command shadowing a training mission in 2015, and I realized, there's no, what I would consider a fire engine. Right. They're not here. There's none here, And so I started asking questions. It's like, no, they can't drive in the woods. We have these, And so I was like, oh, okay. So it started to click at that point. Right. Meanwhile, you have, I'm looking right now, they have Ross, which you may have run into once or twice before, Paul, is Radiological Operations Support Specialist. And they have them Type 3 to Type 1. I would bet that in general, those probably go by the size of the incident.
Right. Same with IMTs, right? Typically your IMT would match right up with the type of incident, but no, you make a really good point that it's not apples to apples every time, right? The idea concept is that you know what you have and that you can label it in a certain way that makes it so everybody understands what it can do, and then you can apply that to what you need, right? And you can share it to others that may need that particular feature, if you will, of that particular resource. Try to keep it generic as much as I can. So.
Right. And so, incident management teams, and again, this is kind of how I'm wired, for better or worse, until I retire. Incident management teams are structured recently so that you have Type 3 teams are considered, for the most part, regional teams, although there are some state versions. They're considered regional teams, and most of those regional teams are what's called all hazards, meaning that they don't specialize in fire, they don't specialize in Coast Guard with hazardous materials, etc. But they know the process, they can solve problems, I guess is how I would describe it. Wildfire used to have Type 2 and Type 1, meaning the biggest teams and then the between Type 3 and Type 1. And in the past year or so, they've changed those to they're now called complex incident management teams, which, whatever. But
sounds cooler.
So now they've gotten rid of those two types and said, they were really close to doing the same thing before. Let's just call them this. And based on some very generic recent experience, I would say that, that because something is specifically incident management teams, because they're, if they say Type 2 or a complex incident management team, doesn't necessarily mean they're better than Type 3 or more capable than Type 3. It just means, for the most part, that those are focused on wildland fire discipline. So on our team, we don't have wildland firefighters. Right. But if we could send 25 people and work a wildland fire if you give us the right positions that do have experience in it.
Right.
Like operations, who makes tactical decisions, safety officer, for the personal protective equipment and mitigations and things like that. Whereas if you send some of the wildland fire, and this is me again being very high level, some of those teams who aren't necessarily experienced with it would have a much harder time dealing with debris management, damage assessment, re-entry by citizens into a disaster area, things like that. So it's a different skill set.
Is like, but you're so focused on one particular type of an event, and you always do that type of event, right? It happens often enough where you're kind of always in that event. Being able to kind of move between different types of events is a different skill set altogether.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I understand for people who don't hear this every day, that's confusing. Everything we just said, but I think that kind of that gives like the high level overview of incident complexity. Again, I was surprised that it came up in the planning section chief course as often as it did because I guess, and this is something I would have said too, that the planning section chief is the IC supervisor, or that
yeah, that's true.
They can keep the IC on track. So maybe that's one of the reasons why it's so prolific within that curriculum.
Right.
But for the most part, like you identified earlier, if you're doing unit level stuff, whatever, you'll probably never even see it. Yeah. I mean, same too. If you're in a fire department, you're a firefighter, and you're just dealing with type 5, type 4 incidents all the time. You probably don't even think about complexity. Never comes across to you as something like that you need to worry about or analyze, because you're always kind of in that. You never really go above that typical response. Even though you maybe should have, or have there was something that occurred that you maybe would have broached into a higher complex, more complex incident. Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I mean, there's the last thing I'll kind of say. To try not to complicate it, but when what you just said and what we were talking about earlier with the scenario with the tornadoes, our fire department. I'm not a firefighter. I'm just giving what I've seen and what I've heard. Our firefighters, ICs, will go out to an incident, and if it meets a certain threshold that they're going to, a certain incident types, they'll do what's called a command board. So they have like a whiteboard they'll pull out, and they have certain, maybe they create objectives, maybe they do a sketch map, maybe they say like, here's the actions we've taken, here's our next planned actions, whatever. And so they manage that off of that command board, okay? And I'm saying that because I'm going to line it up with the rest of ICS in a minute. So if you go out west and you meet the same small team incident commander who's out dealing with a brush fire, they have an ICS 201.
Right.
And so ICS 201 is a FEMA, or actually an NWCG, which is the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, form that does the exact same thing as the command boards.
Right.
You put in, what your objectives are as an incident commander. You put in your planned actions, your organizational structure, who's doing what. You can put either resource status on there, all the list of resources you have for accountability.
Right.
And it's literally the exact same thing as the command boards. Now, that becomes important because when they perform that analysis, they can identify, hey, we need a team that's larger than just me and what I can keep in my head to come in here and help deal with this. And then they can use that ICS 201 or the command board to brief the team that's coming in to help them. And then just turn it over to them, and then they go back to work dealing with the bad thing.
Right.
While somebody else worries about the PIO, the public information issues, and the logistical issues. Like, we need hand wash stations and bathrooms and food. Like, one incident commander, it sounds silly, but one person who's trying to make the bad thing go away can't focus
Doesn't want to focus on that. They can't. You're right. Yeah, they can't.
No one can. And it's not like throwing rocks at the folks. Like, no one has the capacity to make minute-to-minute life safety decisions and also worry about, do we have enough hand sanitizer?
Right.
You know what I mean? It sounds silly, but that's the truth of it. And so when you get on these incidents, they're going to last days. That's when it matters, because now you're here days. If you don't have appropriate sanitation, if you don't have hand sanitizer, now you're going to create a secondary emergency for yourself because your people are going to get sick.
Yep.
And so this is it's once you see it happen, you're like, okay, I understand.
Yeah.
And it's even when I'm saying it right now, I'm like, it sounds silly, but I know why it happens.
Right.
So it's just I guess I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to tie it back to like how it transitions from like, okay, we're local, this is big, let's hand it off to somebody else so that we can go back to dealing with the threat.
Well, you also made a really good point, and in real life, we've talked about this a bunch, but in class and in training and in Central City, you're going to get 201s that are filled out, right? And they're going to be nice and neat, and they're going to be completed in a very formal way. And in the real world, I mean, there are places that do 201s. I'm not saying they don't, but in the real world, for the most part, you're not going to see a 201, especially one that's nicely filled out. You're going to see a command board, most likely from your fire department, and that's what you want to get, because that is, like you just said, that is your 201. It just may look slightly different, but the information is all there, and you're definitely going to want to get your hands on that thing so you can take that and then start applying your planning process efficiently. So if you see that, if you're thinking like, I took this training and they said I get this 201, where is this thing? It's like, no. Go get the command board.
And in our case, as you mentioned, the way I like to preface this when I'm talking to the team or even doing training is, outside of Wildland Fire or Coast Guard, maybe you don't expect to see that 201.
Right.
And I guess to add on to what you were saying, I've been on local incidents that didn't fit fire. It wasn't a fire incident. It wasn't something we deal with all the time, but it was a big incident. Yeah. And when I got there to assist, they hadn't even touched a command board. It's like, well, this isn't a fire.
Right. It breaks their process. Right. Yeah, it breaks their process.
Once you throw off the algorithm,
right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
It becomes a little bit more of an issue. And that may have been very specific to that individual. But I thought it was like, so who's here? Oh, I can check CAD. It's like, so you don't know?
Right.
You don't have a list like right in front. No, because it wasn't a fire.
Right.
So yeah, it was an interesting scenario. So like I said, I can talk about this stuff all day. Me and Paul were talking before this podcast and saying, this will be really quick. I don't know how much we can talk about instant complexity, but here we are 50 minutes later.
Yeah, I know, right?
I could still go on for another 2 or 3 hours, and
right.
Everybody. Maybe this is some nice prior to bed podcast. Just put on your headphones. Let our soothing voices and boring topics lull you to sleep. So yeah, I'll just shut up. So what do you got going on for the next couple weeks, Paul?
Other than just kind of trying to keep up with my family stuff that's going on, just typical running kids around. My son does track, so it's track season, so going to track meets all the time, and then trying to keep the NCR straight with public alert and warning, which is always a challenge. Not too much else. I'm hoping to jump on some Helldivers. We haven't had a chance to play much this past week because you were doing something that wasn't that important, like teaching planning section. Cutting into our gaming time. So,
right.
But yeah, that's about it. Enjoying the weather, hopefully.
Yeah, it's supposed to be almost 70 today, so I get to spend the day doing yard work. It's funny, we're talking about your son doing track. My son literally thinks he's Sonic the Hedgehog. I swear to you. Like, I let him watch the Sonic movies.
Yeah.
He became obsessed, so if you've ever seen the movie, Sonic calls, because Sonic's an alien, and he calls the cop that he makes friends with Donut Lord, because he always sees him eating donuts. So he calls the girls Donut Lord. He was for a little while there. And then he basically, he has his little tablet, his Amazon tablet. He'll be playing the old Sega Genesis Sonic games.
That's awesome.
Like, they're on the tablet.
Yeah.
He can't figure them out. But so he'll move Sonic and then sit down and go, watch me go fast, and just take off running through the house. And it's absolute chaos. So,
that's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. I'm like, you got my genetics, dude. Let's not get carried away with the fast thing,
Right.
Like, lift some weights or something. Let's not focus on fast, So, anyway. Yeah, every day is an adventure, man.
Yeah, so, that's true.
So I think, we're certainly open to taking recommendations if there's certain topics that anybody listening kind of wants us to discuss, no matter how silly you think it is or how silly you think we'll think it is.
Yeah.
Feel free to send the recommendations. Like I said, we're going to start to dabble more in incident command, but it's like I said, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of training that we'd be trying to put into an hour.
Right. And we're not trying to do like a FEMA class as a podcast either, right? So we do encourage, as we talk about some of these concepts, we keep it light, and we also try to keep it fairly high level, generic-ish. So, hopefully that inclines you to, in your case, wherever you may come from, specialty-wise or jurisdiction-wise or whatever you do when you're listening to the podcast, if you're interested in this stuff, to go look into it more, right? To go take a look at some of the resources we mentioned, to go actually look up, the FEMA incident complexity analysis, guidance, look at the RTLT, like all that kind of stuff, like just kind of explore the topic some more, and hopefully this kind of also sidles up next to some training you may take or have taken in the past or the future. So, but yeah, we want to keep it semi-interesting and not super dry and boring too. So hopefully we've kind of hit that target on this one.
I was just thinking, maybe for a podcast, and maybe it's like more like a 10-part miniseries, but maybe we could do a podcast or 10 about stupid political situations. Around emergency management.
We could do
let's
that.
talk about some of the stupid shit that we've run into that, basically egos,
Right.
politics got in the way of progress.
Political
blah, blah,
driven
blah, blah.
shit.
Oh my god.
Yes.
Because as soon as it went through my head, I was like 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
I stopped at 9.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's just so many.
I mean, there's so many examples.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean that's
Yeah.
kind of the reality, right? Too.
Right.
Is you could learn all this great stuff, and this is why you should do it, and then politics kind of comes in and takes that away from you.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't matter what's best for people.
Yeah. Unfortunately, true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it at that. So, Paul, unless you have something to add or something else you want to talk about, we're at 55 minutes.
Yes. No. I'm glad we're back on the we're back in the saddle, back on the horse, doing this again, and we'll close it out with. Well, I guess I should say this. So, just as another reminder, since we did it at the beginning, we'll do it again at the end. If you've made it this far in the podcast episode,
congratulations! You're
thank
one
you.
of us now.
Yes, at Surviving CC on Twitter X and Surviving Central City at Gmail. Ideas, questions, we love all that kind of stuff. Engagement is always great for us. And then if you do have Facebook still, we're on there as well. For those that don't know, I think a year and a half ago when we did the other episodes we had out, Ian made it very clear that we will never be on Instagram. So you cannot find us there. And maybe someday we'll put like little clips of our podcast, like just the spicy stuff on TikTok or something like that.
Do we have it? We just talked about incident complexity for an hour. I'm not sure how spicy.
Yeah,
I know.
I know. We'll find something. You work your magic. But otherwise, to my survivors out there, just keep on surviving.
Thanks, everyone.